All right, well, welcome everybody. We're excited to have you here. My name is Katie Cook. I work for Elanco Animal Health, which is a global animal health company, and we're here to talk to you about the unlikely partners of driving climate neutral farming. So I'm joined here with a couple of panelists from our dairy industry, and we're excited to share a little bit about what's going on there. I know Elanco is a proud sponsor of this, and it's something that I'm passionate about as I work in it every day, but I'm also passionate about because I grew up in it. Personally, I grew up in a small cow-calf operation in northern Michigan. I know there was in a previous talk, there was another cow-calf operator. And for me, it's not just about what I do every day, the work, it's also personal what I get to do at home. And so I've seen firsthand in the conversations that I have on the weekends or at Christmas break with my family, and what are we doing in our operation? What does that look like? What do we do that's right for the animal? What do we do that's right for the land? And then ultimately, what do we do that's right for the business as we think about the long term? And personally, for my family's operation, it's getting ready to transition from one generation to the next as my sister goes back to the family farm and takes that over. So I'm really excited to talk about that here with a couple of our partners as we think about environmental sustainability and what does that mean from a farming perspective, and what does that mean to our farmers, and how do we actually implement that today? Now, if I switch back into the Elanco version of that, what is a pharmaceutical company doing here, is we believe firmly that there's an opportunity for our customers, our farmers and ranchers, to actually be part of the climate solution. And so we're working on a bunch of different innovation technologies that help them mitigate their carbon footprint, reduce methane, as we heard about in a previous talk, but also the tools and services around there that help them measure and monetize those ultimately to have the impact. And so as we think about that, there's a lot of different ways that we can approach it. And there's a lot of different things as we think about connecting the consumer. That's had a lot of conversation around that, to the food companies, and then the farmers that are going to be putting those practices in and day out. So I'm really excited to have Dr. Greg Beathard here from Ponderosa Dairy in Kansas to talk with us, as well as Hansel New from the Dairy Farmers of America, who leads their sustainability efforts there. They're both experts in their field. They're both either doing the day-to-day work on the farm themselves or working with dairy farmers across the US to actually implement these technologies and these solutions. So we'll get started and maybe have each of you just give a brief introduction to who you are and what are the sustainability things that you're doing on your operation. How do you view it? So Greg, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. So our dairy is located in southwest Kansas. I've been a dairy farmer now for about 7 years. Prior to that, I was a consultant for a long time. So my background prior to being a dairy farmer was as a nutritionist. So I kind of have an interest in some of the feeding topics that you heard in the last session. So sustainability is a word that is used a lot, obviously, in a lot of different contexts. And I'm not sure that everybody really has the same definition of it. And so I'll kind of give you our definition, how we view sustainability related to our dairy. To me, sustainability means being there for the long term. So I choose to use maybe a different word that a friend of mine educated me on a couple years ago. And the word I use is infinite. We like to think of our dairy as infinite, meaning we'd like to be around in 30 or 40 years. So all the decisions we make today on our dairy are geared towards remaining in business for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We want to continue to pay our employees for 20, 30, 50 years. We want to have a viable business. So the first part of sustainability or being infinite to me is being profitable. If we can't make money, we can't survive, we can't continue to pay our employees, and we will go out of business. But then the next parts of that, which are equally important, is we've got to take care of our cows, because our business at its core is about cows. And if we don't care for our cows, we've got no future. We've got to care for our people, our employees. If we don't recruit good people and take care of them and build a culture that people feel a part of, then we don't have any chance of being successful. We've got to care for our land, so in our environment. So an environment around our dairy, the land that grows the feed for our cows, if we don't care for that and our natural resources, we're not going to have a future. And lastly, we got to care for our community. We are not the only people in our community. We have neighbors, and we need to care for them and do what's best for them as well, because if we don't have neighbors that are on board with what we're doing, it's going to be difficult for us to have a future. So if we do all those things together, we've got a chance to be around in 30 or 40 years. So the decisions we make today about everything we do have that long-term vision in mind. So how we manage water in our area, how we look at products like 3-NOP or Bovaer in terms of reducing carbon emissions, all these things factor into, hey, we want to be around for a long term. So for us, that's what sustainability means for us.
Very interesting. Hansel, maybe talk to us a little bit about Dairy Farmers of America and their approach, maybe a little bit about the organization. Some people may not be as familiar with the cooperative, and then a little bit about your sustainability journey.
No, happy to. So first of all, welcome everyone. It's great to be here with you all. So Dairy Farmers of America is probably not a well-known organization because we don't slap our logo on consumer-facing products, right? You don't see DFA fluid milk or DFA cheese. We do have several owned brands, but ultimately we're a farmer-owned milk marketing cooperative. We represent about 5,500 family farms that are scattered throughout the US and about 45, 46 different states. So we're national in scope, and we take our members' milk and we either process that directly or we ship it to other customers who then make dairy products out of it. So I like to say that you've probably never heard of DFA, but you've likely had DFA products, so milk that comes from DFA member farms. So as I mentioned, we're a farmer-owned cooperative. That means that just like your local, maybe Saturday market that operates on a co-op level, it's the same principle. We are owned by, we are governed by, and we are here for dairy farmers, which is a very different model than a lot of the large food and beverage companies globally, right, who either answer to their CEO if they're privately held, or they answer to their shareholders if they're a publicly traded company. We are ultimately accountable to dairy farmers. So that does a couple different things. It helps keep us grounded in what a supply chain looks like, because unlike in a lot of food and beverage companies where you're maybe 2, 3, 4 levels away from actually the farms and what the farms are doing, we're next door neighbors. We hear farms, we represent farms, and ultimately our mission in life is to help support farmers in their sustainability journey. So kind of building off of what Greg said about sustainability, how DFA focuses on sustainability is really, first of all, that longevity aspect. A lot of our farmer owners come from operations that have been dairying for 2, 3, 4, in some cases 5 generations. And so this is a long and proud tradition for a lot of family farms that we represent. And they bring their whole selves to their dairies, their culture, their family, their sweat equity. All of their investment is a lot of times in their family farming operation. So we take that with a certain amount of pride and respect, realizing that ultimately we are representing those family farm operations. And so when we think about sustainability, yes, it's that longevity piece, and not forgetting that these farms, if they want to pass off their farm to the next generation, which a lot of our dairy farms are laser focused on that, how do we pass on the farm to the next generation? And since that's their focus, yes, when we talk about sustainability, longevity, and sustainable dairying, that includes, they have to be able to make, this is their family livelihood, so there has to be profit that has a motivating factor for them as well. But sustainability is also a lot of times quantifying what they're already doing. So dairy has been at this a long time, a lot longer than this term called sustainability has been around. They used to call it farming really, really efficiently with limited resources. So dairy farms have been at this a very long time. There have been some third-party life cycle assessments, for example, that have shown that since the close of World War II, it takes 90% less land and 63% greenhouse gas emissions and 65% less water to produce a glass of milk today than it did at the end of World War II. That's amazing. That's an amazing efficiency journey. If we double click on that a little bit and look at just a 10-year period of time, there was another life cycle assessment, peer-reviewed scientific data, that was wrapped up in 2017 that showed that just in that 10-year period, the greenhouse gas emissions to produce that same glass of milk was reduced another 19%. So just amazing efficiency journey of where dairy producers have been. And that journey's not over. They're going to continue to innovate. We just need to make sure that dairy producers, their family farm operations, are given the tools and the right incentives to be able to chase after the potential that's still there. And they're innovative and they're lean enough that they're going to go chase down that potential.
Very good. Well, I know we all talked a little bit about longevity and some of the efficiency, but let's maybe narrow our conversation here a little bit on the environmental footprint and what can we do to reduce our environmental footprint on dairies. So, Greg, I know you're doing a lot of different things today. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the specific practices that you're implementing today on your farm that are helping reduce that environmental footprint?
Sure, and back to the sustainability topic term generally, and the word I used, infinite, that we're doing a lot of things, but first of all, everything we do has to make economic sense. We just can't go out there. We're in a really tight margin business. Any of you that are familiar with agriculture know this, whether you're making grain or milk or any type of commodity product. Like my milk that we produce is no different than anybody else's milk. The value is no different. Milk is milk, and it's kind of all the same. So therefore, I can't compete in a really low margin industry if I go add a lot of cost into my system without any change in the price of my product or some way to recoup that investment. So everything we do, it's got to make economic sense within our operation. So, and a couple examples of that we currently employ. We have a methane digester that was alluded to in the last session, and this is in partnership with Shell. It's a big investment. We are able to sell carbon credits out of that, so those are offsetting credits, which is different than the insetting credits that we'll be talking about here. That have done a lot of good things for our dairy. It's definitely, obviously, reduced our carbon footprint tremendously, the amount of methane released. It's a good thing to turn, like Dr. Mitloner, I think, said it really well. It's like, wow, what a great opportunity. We can turn that energy, instead of wasting it and just releasing it in the atmosphere, let it set aside the carbon aspect of it, but just the energy waste, and we run that through a vehicle, enabled to power vehicle. That's a great thing. So we're doing that, and that project is going really well. The second thing we have is electric cars, and a lot of people think like, well, why do we have electric vehicles on our dairy? What are we trying to reduce climate? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good part of it, but the main reason is they make sense for our dairy. They're cheaper to operate. They don't break down. Gasoline or internal combustion engines have something like 20,000 moving parts. Electric cars have like 20 moving parts. They don't break. We've had them for 4 or 5 years, and I love them because there's no maintenance. You just replace the tires and boom, you just go. Where regular engines, for us, we have a lot of problems with. So there's a good example of, hey, if there's a market reason to do something, if it makes economic sense, if it helps reduce our carbon footprint, it's just win, 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 win. And so we take advantage of those kind of opportunities the best we can. We're also trying now to sell insetting credits for using a product that reduces enteric methane emissions, and that's again what this panel is about today, and we'll get into that more in a bit, but we're actively trying to reduce our enteric methane emissions and be able to sell those credits. We think that there's a market for that, and we think that buyers within the supply chain are going to see value in that and say, yeah, our consumers really would rather have dairy products with a lower carbon footprint, and we can do it. So let's make an incentive to do it. Let's make it a voluntary market where we can participate and not have somebody shoving it down our throat saying you must do this or you must do that. I think it's more likely to be successful and work really well if it's kind of that type of environment. So we're pursuing that as hard as we can and trying to sell those credits that we generated last year. And then as time goes on, there'll be more opportunities. I can't tell you today what they might be, but I can tell you we're going to have our eyes wide open and looking for any of those opportunities because they're just win-win scenarios and good for everybody.
Oh, great. Well, Hansel, you guys partner with many farmers across the nation. I think you said 45 states. Was it 45?
45.
And so you have quite a different breadth, right? You have large farmers, you have small farmers. You guys also set the first science-based targets, SBI targets, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the dairy supply chain as well. And so I know you're working with your farmers every day. Could you share a little bit about what you're seeing on farm as farms are trying to decarbonize their farm and moving more towards climate neutral farming?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dairy Farmers of America, we set a science-based target back in 2020, and that was very intentional. We work with a lot of the leading food and beverage companies, not just in the U.S. but globally. Many of them have science-based targets as well. And so we wanted to make sure we're very much aligned with that, knowing that, as I mentioned a little bit in the introductory comments, we know that dairy can be part of the climate solution. Dairy's been on that journey for a long time now, and with new technologies and best practices, we're confident we're going to continue to see further advancements and further opportunities for reduction in that space with the right incentives and the right practices in place. So when we look at it from representing, again, about 5,500 family-owned dairy operations throughout the lower 48 states, operating in about 45 states. We have to take a very broad lens approach because our farms are very different sizes. So one way of thinking about farmers that supply DFA is we break it down into what we call quartiles. So it takes 25% of our members to create 25% of our milk, and we break it down that way because it helps provide some insight into the types of producers that we represent. And so, for example, it takes over 4,000 farms just to make up 25% of our milk volume. Those family farms are on average herd size is about 100, 120 cows. So very small operations, relatively speaking. On the other end of the spectrum, we have farms that they're maybe milking 7,000, 10,000 cows in their operation. So with that type of diversity, and again, we're up in the northeast states, we're in the southeast, we're in the desert southwest, and so dairy farm operations are going to look very different across those different geographies. And so we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach, but we do look at different bucket areas. So when you look at a farm and where the emissions come from, it's basically 4 different bucket areas. It's the cow herself. In the previous panel, if you were around for that one, they talked a little bit about that, about how when a cow is digesting cellulosic or fibrous-based feedstuffs, they're naturally producing methane. We call that enteric methane because it comes from the rumen of the cow itself. The second category after enteric methane is manure management. In other words, what comes out of the back end of the cow. And then it's the emissions that go into creating the feedstuffs that cow herd is actually producing, whether that's a combination of grasses and the managed land for those grasses, whether it's corn silage or alfalfa or other feedstuffs that go into a cow. Cows are, I like to say, the ultimate recyclers because they can take things like cotton hulls and waste carrots and things that humans would never eat, and they can extract the energy out of that and actually keep a lot of products out of the landfill at the same time. And so the feed portion, that's kind of the fourth focus area or bucket area. And the fourth is just generating energy for the farm, whether it's diesel for the tractors or electricity for some of the trucks, in the case of Greg's operation, or just power and electricity to run the barn and the milking equipment, et cetera. So it's those 4 bucket areas that really go into a farm's overall footprint. And so we have, when we look at our science-based target, and when we look at the interventions for the farm, we break down the different interventions into those 4 different bucket areas. And again, back to the diversity of farms that Dairy Farmers of America represents, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And it would be really difficult for one farm to do every intervention possible, but it's definitely doable for every farm to do something in that space. And so we have different levers, different tools that we rely on, and we'll talk more about that tools as we get more into the conversation, I'm sure.
Okay, well maybe we'll shift to that. And Greg, talk a little bit, you mentioned some of the tools, and you mentioned innovation. And I know in the early conversation we also talked about data. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit as you think about what you're doing, not just today, but as you look into the future on your operation? What role does innovation play? What role does data play? And how are you actually measuring the reductions that you're having on your farm?
Yeah, so data plays a huge role in our dairy, and I think those of you that aren't intricately familiar with dairies would probably be surprised at how much data we deal with every day. And we like to make decisions based on data. And there's so many decisions that we've got to make every day, so many things that can happen on a dairy. You know, we've got milking systems, we've got feeding systems, we've got a biological critter that all kinds of bad things can happen to. So we have lots and lots of computers. For example, some of you may be familiar with I call them Fitbits or the fitness watches, you know, and they take keep tabs on your activity, how many steps you take a day, and all. We have those for our cows, so they've all got a collar on them that keeps track of the cow's activity, and it tells us when a cow is sick, which is really handy. So instead of looking at every cow every day to try to figure out when they're sick, because as we know, cows can't talk to us and tell us when they're sick, we use this technology to really sort out the ones that need our attention and need our help and need a cow doctor to look at them and say, okay, something's wrong, she's not feeling well, let's spend the time and really give her a complete exam and see what's wrong. So we've got massive amounts of data coming in every day. So we use that to make better decisions about our animals and about our productivity and about our efficiency. And going forward, that's just going to get bigger and bigger. You know, if you walk around this show, I did yesterday a little bit in the convention center, and wow, there's stuff there like I can't even tell you what it is. I'm so far behind on this, but there's a lot of AI and there's a lot of data management. And I envision AI being an integral part of our future with all the data that we have, using an AI tool to better look at that data and say, gee, here's a problem presenting itself that we really weren't even aware was happening, so we can be on top of things, fix problems quicker. So that dairy farms have all this data. The problem is we're not always real organized in how we put it together and gather it, and it's a little difficult. We happen to be on our dairy pretty savvy with spreadsheets, our whole group, so we use spreadsheets to keep all our data in, which is not the most efficient, but that's what we do. But a lot of other dairies don't really have that skill set necessarily in-house, so we struggle with that a bit. But the basic stuff that we need to verify that if we're going to feed a product and reduce enteric methane emissions, we really need to know just a few simple things like how many cows do we have day to day and how much did they eat. That's not really very hard. Almost every dairy farm has that information readily available. Most of us use software to feed our cows. We use software to manage our cows. So all that data is there. It's just a matter of gathering it. And what Elanco has a program called uplook. And uplook is a process that allows me as a dairy farmer to get my data to them in a verifiable form. And what it has to be is that the buyer of the credit needs to be able to have a third-party independent verifier come in and verify that, yeah, this is accurate, this is real. You know, I'm not making stuff up here about how many cows are milking, how much they're eating. You use the science behind what the product says it can do. And there's, I think Dr. Mitloder mentioned there's 50, I think he said 50 peer-reviewed articles now on 3NOP. So there's a lot of science out there to say, okay, if it's fed appropriately and used as directed, boom, here's the amount of methane reduction you should get. Then I just have to prove, okay, here's how many animals I had, here's how much feed I put in, therefore, based on that, here's the number of carbon credits we should be generating every day based on that. So it's pretty simple. We've all got the data, but it's got to be a system with integrity, so the buyer of the credit feels good that there's integrity in the system. This credit that I'm buying is not foo-foo, it's real stuff, and it's a real number. And the analogy I always use is currency. Like, you know, if somebody, Katie, if you were to offer me a cup of coffee and I say, well, here's $2 for the coffee, and I gave her $2 US, she'd say, okay, great, she'd take the money. If I offered her 2 Monopoly dollars, she'd kind of say, I ain't taking that, right? So the Monopoly money has no integrity, the US currency does. And that's kind of what, in my view, what this is like. This system has to have integrity so the buyers feel like, okay, what I'm buying, this is real, it's tangible, it has value, and I can go to my customers and say, hey, look what we've done, we've lowered our carbon footprint, and everybody buys in that this is real and there's no greenwashing or any of this other shenanigans going on.
Yeah, so we think that's really important. You mentioned uplook. That's something that my team works a lot on, and it's something that we're continuing to evolve and continue to partner with our customers on, and I think you hit on a lot of key points, right? How do we make sure that it stays verifiable? How do we make sure that we don't have greenwashing and that it's credible? And so when we look at that, for those of you that don't know what uplook is, it is a carbon footprint tool that we go on farm and we partner with farmers like Greg and say, okay, what data do you have? And then we say, okay, based on that data, here's your carbon footprint. And then we also look at the different interventions. So whether that's, the example was 3NOP, or some of the other methane mitigations or other tools that they have, and we would look at the science that professors like Dr. Mitloder and others have done and say, okay, when they implement those technologies, what is the reduction that they have on farm? And so we're able to help partner with the day-to-day real live data that farmers have day in and day out with the science-based data that we have on these different interventions and help them actually articulate a CO2 emissions reduction. And put it into a quantifiable unit so that you can actually say this is the reduction that is happening on farm. And then that allows us, as we talk about the carbon insetting markets and some of the other opportunities, allows the farmer to be able to actually articulate what is that reduction on farm.
And the beauty of that too, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Size neutral was mentioned
Yes.
in the last session, and this time Hansel mentioned that several. It truly is size neutral. It doesn't matter how many cows you milk. The process is the same, and it's based on how many animals and how much feed they ate. So things like methane digesters are sometimes it's really difficult for a small dairy to invest the capital in a methane digester. So there's a limited opportunities on that end. But this is totally size neutral. Anybody can participate, and anybody can be a part of it, which is, I think, kind of unique part of it.
Yeah. When I think about the data, like the size neutral, maybe Hansel talk a little bit about data, and you think about the different sizes. How do we think about data in all those other ones? Is it, what kind of threshold, or what do we need to be thinking about as an industry as we partner with our producers on getting the data so we have those credible reductions as we think about it in the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. Data is critically important in this space. What we like to communicate to producers is that, look, your data has value. Maybe today, maybe if they're a small producer, maybe they're just keeping records in a notebook, or maybe they're using spreadsheets or other forms of data collection. But when it comes to incentivizing producers to do the right thing and getting credit for what in some cases are things that they're already doing that are sustainable, or if they want to do something new, like do a feed additive, for example, that has a greenhouse gas reduction benefit. Data is critical to capture that, and so a lot of farms get that intuitively. It's like, yeah, my data has value, and dairy farmers are a lot like all of us, right? They are also concerned about, well, what about my data? How secure is it? How is my data going to be used, right? I mean, all of us have smartphones and other devices on us, and there's all sorts of this data, but it's how secure is the data? So having, again, that credibility of the platform is really important to make sure that the data is being quantified in a responsible way, yep, and that what it generates is real. It's got that third-party verification and validation, and then that data then transforms into a tradable commodity, which are these greenhouse gas benefits, these carbon credits. We can call them carbon insets or carbon offsets in some cases. But it's that it all starts with the data, and having quality data, having data that's usable in these platforms. A lot of times that's how we talk about sustainability with our producers. It's like, look, it's doing what you're doing a lot of times today, but you have to capture it. You have to be willing to go through what's called an MMRV system, a measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification system or platform, and that's how you're going to capture that value that you're generating on farm.
So you're talking about value generating it on farm. If you guys were here for the previous talk, we talked about the first carbon insetting market from Athian, which gives the farmers the opportunity to monetize their emissions. Greg, I'd love to hear from you. Like, how do you think about that in your operation? How are you looking at monetizing, and how does a platform like Athian support that?
Yeah, so the insetting market is obviously different than the offsetting, but from my perspective, one of the big differences in the insetting market is I still get to retain the credit, if you will, internally within the supply chain, where if I sell a carbon credit, an offset, it goes to a different industry. An example was used in the last session, I think, about planting trees in the rainforest or something, diverting, buying a credit for something you do in a completely other industry. The problem is that's gone. So like if I sell those credits, I can't claim that my milk is low carbon or anything because I've sold the credits and they're out of the supply chain and they're gone. Where what's nice about insets is they stay within the supply chain, so I can legitimately say, hey, the carbon footprint on my milk is lowered by this process. So what attracted me to this from the very beginning, when I first heard about it probably a year or so ago, was that it's a voluntary market. And a voluntary market, I think, is key. I worked in Europe for a long time, and if you look at the way the European approaches some of this is just mandatory. You have to do this, you have to do that. And I think we've got a much better chance of making this really successful and having an impact on our greenhouse gas emissions by having this a voluntary market that makes sense, that there's a financial incentive for everybody to do it. It's good for the consumer in the end, it's good for the dairy on the front end, and it's good for the processors in between. And I think it's got a chance to truly make that work. You know, I think in the beginning, I'm not a big fan of government intervention in agriculture. I think generally it doesn't work well, but for something like this, I think the government can help something get started and help a market get started. So there may be some subsidies in the beginning to maybe get this momentum going. I think the buyers of these credits need to get going and see, okay, this works. Yeah, we believe in this, that these credits are legitimate, and we can go now to our customers and say we've lowered our carbon footprint. So I think the whole process and the whole market, I just love it. And I see this market getting more than just aligning buyers and sellers right now, but actually allowing some risk management strategies with it and buying and trading options. I think there's a lot of things that could happen to this down the road. To me, they're really exciting. So we're actively participating in it. We have gone through the process with Elanco, or we're going through it now with Athean, I should say, of establishing how many credits we generated last year based on our practices. And we have those credits for sale now in the marketplace and haven't found a buyer just yet, because again, this is just right in the very, very beginning of it. But I'm really optimistic that we can get this going, keep it going, and I think it's going to be good for our industry, it's going to be good for our consumer, and good for everybody.
Great. Well, earlier this year, so we have traded some credits in the first livestock insetting market, and DFA actually purchased some of those credits, right, Hansel? So maybe talk to us a little bit about, like, why is DFA getting involved in it? What is the role of the marketplace, and how do you see that rolling out for your farmers?
Yeah, DFA, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is right in the middle between family farm owners on one side as a milk marketing cooperative, and on the other side, selling dairy and dairy products to all the large CPG companies, food and beverage companies, not just in North America, but around the world. And so part of our job is to communicate what the opportunity is in this space. So earlier this year, DFA was the first purchaser of these inset credits for the ruminants feed additive in this on the Athean platform, which was really exciting for us. We were happy to be first to go and really to demonstrate how it's done for other food and beverage companies out there who, as I mentioned, they have the same goals. They have these science-based targets a lot of times that they're working against. And so this is a solution that's available today. It's new, yes, but it has the credibility, it has the documentation, it has the processes in place to be a credible platform. And now we just need to collaborate. We need to reach that critical mass. And so DFA was proud to kind of get the ball rolling, if you will. But we're also in a position where we can have those conversations with a lot of the dairy buyers and start to have those conversations about how do carbon inset markets, like through the Athean platform, play a role in helping them meet their science-based targets too, because it's a win-win scenario if we can keep the carbon reductions within the supply chain. I did want to pick up on something that Greg said also about how insets are very different than offsets, because you mentioned something very important, Greg, about if it's an offset. In other words, if a carbon reduction on a dairy farm is going outside of the supply chain, is being sold to like Google or Microsoft or Southwest Airlines or whomever, those carbon reductions can't then be counted against the farm's environmental reduction footprint. So we have a potential real problem here of folks who work the land. And I don't care if that's dairy, if that's other commodity crops, if that's forest systems. It's only those who work the land who have the opportunity, in a lot of cases, to really radically reduce emissions or store carbon in the soil through a process called soil carbon sequestration. And I just wanted to point out for everybody that the carbon accounting rules today are not set up to give credit to those producers when it comes to offsets. So insets, we've got a real win-win solution where the whole supply chain benefits. The farm can count those credits, the processor, like DFA, can count those credits, and the end customer can count those credits. And that's not considered double counting. But if it's an offset, if a dairy farm, and if to use our example, is selling those carbon reductions outside the supply chain, the dairy can then not count those carbon reduction. So in other words, they don't get credit for being part of the decarbonization solution. And then we think that's a real problem. And so there's, these carbon accounting rules were set up when really land-based industries like agriculture and forestry really weren't stakeholders at the table when those original carbon accounting rules were set up. So we think, just like a lot of other things in our world, we think it needs to evolve. And I'm not talking about, okay, let's now allow double counting. What I'm talking about is, just like in the financial world, you have several different ways of looking at your investment or your funding, right? You've got gross sales, and then you've got net profitability, right? We think that there's room for the carbon accounting rules to evolve so that they can have the same type of differentiation. Gross emissions reductions versus net emissions reductions. In other words, what the farms can actually account for and take credit for in the supply chain. So we think globally there needs to be expanded thinking in this area so that at the end of the day, regardless of if the farm producing those environmental benefits gets to directly count it or indirectly count it, they're still getting credit, because today that's not the case. So continuing to think about that, and because if the carbon accounting rules don't eventually evolve, we see already how that can be a disincentive for farmers. It sends the wrong market signals. I talk to producers all the time who are like, hey, should I get involved in like a digester project, because what if I'm gonna have to reduce my emissions by 50%, let's say, and I can't count the emissions reductions from that digester. So is now the right time to invest in that? It creates market uncertainty. Ultimately, we think it sends the wrong signals to producers, and so we think it's an area that needs to continue to be a conversation globally.
Absolutely. So maybe I'll shift a little bit of gear on you, Hansel, because you were talking a little bit earlier about the food and beverage companies, and I know that DFA also actually has some consumer goods. So TruMoo, Borden products, for those of you that are maybe not familiar with some of the ones that you actually see in the grocery store, you're closest to the consumer. So when you think about that and you think about the consumer lens around this, and you and I had a conversation outside even, there's many different types of consumers and what they're looking for. But do you see increased demand for sustainably raised products or lower footprint carbon milk? And how do we think about that, and how should we think about that as an industry, or if you're a farmer like Greg moving forward?
Yeah, we do know that the market research shows that consumers are definitely thinking about this. They care, and a lot of times there's confusion on how they actually take action in this space. Do they go with a particular brand? Do they rely upon a certain symbol on a package that they buy? Do they rely on their peer network? Do they go for a particular diet focus, for example? Is that the way to do it? So there's all sorts of ideas and frankly a lot of confusion out there in the consumer marketplace on how to choose sustainably raised products or how to reduce their carbon footprint, for example. And it's complicated because food is complicated, right? I mean, we think about when you woke up this morning and you had breakfast, what went into your meal planning for that breakfast, right? Did you think about calorie count? Did you think about, well, I'm gonna be sprinting from meeting to meeting today, or from conference session to conference session, I need to catch that and that, so I need energy, so I need to take this into consideration. Maybe it's, okay, I need protein because I'm not gonna eat for another 8 hours, or whatever the case might be. We all think about the value proposition of food very differently, right? It can be culturally influenced. What you were, your ethnic tradition, your training and your background, how you were raised, for example, all influences our food choices. And so when people think about their food and buying sustainably, sometimes the conversation gets overly distilled down until it's just a binary choice, right? Do I want a low carbon product or a not low carbon product? And as we all know, it's much more complicated than that. So for example, if you take your reusable metal water bottles that were given out at South by Southwest, right? They're reusable, they're ultimately recyclable. And you fill that with pond water. Likely that's going to have a lower greenhouse gas footprint than your other beverage that you may choose to drink, right? So a lot of times we boil down sustainability into one attribute, and we say, well, this beverage has a lower footprint, so it must be better. It must be better for the environment, must be better for you, et cetera. Well, we all know that's not the case. And even when you go back and look at the studies, like life cycle assessment studies, those are typically done using just one or two attributes, like greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product produced, right? But when you flip that scenario and you look at, well, what are the emissions based on the nutrient content of that product that you're actually consuming, it completely changes the conversation, right? So you take dairy products where you're getting wholesome nutrition, you're getting a high quality protein included in this beverage, and you look at, okay, if I'm going to look at the nutrition content of this beverage, then it completely changes the conversation around the environmental sustainability of that product. So when you come to what the consumers want, there's also the aspect of willingness to pay, right? We know that for a certain segment of consumer in a certain market, they're willing to pay more for the attributes that they want, right? But because we're selling a commodity ultimately, dairy, and we're selling it in all of its forms, we also have to think about how are we delivering that nutrition to not just those who are willing to pay a premium for it, but to those who struggle socioeconomically, right? So if we're thinking about the low and middle classes, how do we ensure that we're getting nutritious, quality food to people who most need it in the most affordable and efficient way possible? And so there's all these different aspects of sustainable nutrition and claims in the marketplace, but we really do focus on, and one of the things we want to really stress is transparency. People want to know where their food comes from. And so the more we can hear from voices like Greg, who is a dairy farmer, and having dairy farms tell their own story in this space and connecting consumer to the producers of their product, we think that's really going to not only transform but radicalize the conversation in a way where it's creating real dialogue in a way that a lot of the claims today are really too binary to get below the surface.
Yeah, it is definitely confusing. And I'm in the industry, and I know sometimes I look at it and I go through the grocery store and I'm like, this is gluten-free. It's always been gluten-free, right? So as we go through there. But as we think about continuing to move forward, right? So we've talked about evolving different things, different partnerships, and this whole conversation is those unlikely partnerships as we think about driving climate neutrality. We know that collaborations are really important as we think about that. So could you maybe both of us just share, like, what are some of the different collaborations that you see, whether it's NGOs, regulations, policies, pharmaceutical companies, that you see starting to happen in the space, and what do you think needs to continue to happen as we think about collaborating to drive towards climate neutrality?
Go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately we need as many tools as possible, and so what Elanco is doing by bringing products to the market that not only have a very functional benefit, but can also be quantified and can actually accomplish what everybody's after is to quantify the GHG emission reduction, for example, and then ultimately turn that into another commodity. This carbon credit, this carbon inset through like the Ethion platform is really going to be transformative in how we think about collaboration and tools in this space. So, and ultimately we need more collaborators. We need more scientists. We need more NGOs at the table. And we need more solutions through what companies like Elanco can bring. So we're really excited about 3-NOP and the opportunity there, the Bovaer product and the ability to reduce enteric methane emissions. And it's when products like that launch and are successful is what's going to give us the scale necessary to really continue to drive impact. So I talked a little bit about in the beginning about dairy's efficiency journey over the last 67 years, right? And we're confident that that's going to continue, but we need accelerants, which means we need innovation, which means we need tools, which means we need collaborations and partnerships like we've been talking about.
Yep.
So the collaborators, I think, that need to make this go, and I'll break this down simply to my view of the world and my situation, which is about all I seem to understand, is so my dairy produces milk, and we market our milk through DFA. DFA, say, sells that milk to a cheese plant. The cheese plant turns it into cheese. Pizza Hut buys the cheese and puts it under pizza. Okay, that's kind of a trace of what could potentially happen to some of the milk that we produce on our dairy. So I think those downstream collaborators all need to be part of this and say, hey, I can generate the credit by feeding 3-NOP or whatever we happen to do. And everybody downstream has to say, like, hey, there's value there, and we're willing to pay for that value, and we'd like to buy some of those credits. And that's what it's going to take to make this system work. One of the reasons I like the free market aspect of this, or the market aspect of it, rather than a mandate, is that the market creates opportunities for competition, right? I'm hoping there's somebody other than Nathan that comes along and says, gee, we'd like to do this too, because that means I've got more choices where to sell my credits. That's just good. That's good for me. And I think that's a healthy market. And I think if this truly works the way I think it can, we will have that kind of competition. And guess what? If you have a supply and demand in something, the price settles to where it makes sense for everybody. I always say, when you say, what is something worth? How do you know the value of anything? Well, you get two people that one wants to sell and one wants to buy. What they agree on that transaction, that's what it's truly worth. And I think a market finds that. And so that's why I'm excited to have competition, have other people, innovators want to jump in this space to say, hey, 3-NOP works, but I got this other product that also works too, or I've got this other technology or this other technique or whatever, and then suddenly everybody's wanting to jump on board because they see an opportunity. And that's the way, in my view, markets work. And I think if we can get to that, we can really greatly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and do it practically and do it efficiently and make it work for everybody in the whole supply chain.
That's really good. So that's a bit of your vision for the future, right? Is
Yes.
We have this marketplace, we're able to have all these different tools, there's the incentives. As you think about that, like a lot of our targets are around 2030, a lot of the science-based targets for the food companies, et cetera, that have made those. I'll give each of you a chance. What do you think that looks like by 2030 for the industry? What would be the tangible things? What do we look like, in, 6 years? When we're sitting here on this stage, what does your crystal ball say will have happened and where will we be at? Trick question, but.
I think we're going to see a lot more innovation. If there's one thing I've learned working closely with dairy farmers is that you give them a vision, you give them a carrot, for example, and that goes back to the importance of that voluntary incentive-based market, right? You give them a carrot, and dairy farmers are some of the most scrappy, innovative individuals I've ever known or worked with. They will find a way to go after that. And so that's how we're going to create additional value in this space, is through innovation, through collaboration, through a lot of the pre-competitive sharing of information and tools and resources that then will get executed by farmers. But ultimately, we have to show them the way by providing the incentives and by showing that they can diversify their income in this space. Because ultimately it comes back to the fact that less than 2% of our population, the farmers who are creating all the food that we all consume, less than 2% of the population is feeding the world. And so how do we support them? How do we engage them? How do we approach them in a way that's appropriate for them, that's going to work for their family farm operation? And it comes back to tools, resources, opportunities, and incentives. So to get to 2030, we're going to need a lot more of that. And I can guarantee you that you provide the incentives, you provide the market opportunities, you provide the carbon credit marketplace, and dairy farmers, dairy producers will innovate, and we'll get there.
So my great prediction, Katie, for 2030, for whatever it's worth, is I think most of the milk produced in the U.S. will be the dairies producing those milk will be selling insetting credits. I just think it's going to happen. I mean, that's 6 years from now. So take that prediction at 50 cents and get a cup of coffee. That's probably all it's worth, but that's what I think is going to happen. I think this has momentum, and I think it's coming. And I think in 6 years, I think less than 6 years actually, but I think it's going to be a standard practice. You know, where we are in terms of our carbon footprint as an industry, everybody wants to say, okay, my carbon footprint is here. Everybody wants to get to like some semblance of zero or some such thing. I don't really know what all that means. I don't really know where the line in the sand is. All I know is we can get better and will get better. And that change is really what's important. And I think we will continue to head down that path. And as an industry, we will make it happen. I believe that.
No, that's awesome. So continuous improvement, right? The dairy industry's been continuously improving since, I think your quote was from the 1950s on some of those initial stats. And we're committed, we're ready to do that and continue to innovate into the space and bring those opportunities. So I know we've been asking them and peppering them with questions here for the past 50 minutes. So wanted to give you guys an opportunity here in the audience if you have any questions for our panelists.
Boy, there's a big lonely
I know,
microphone
there's a long
up there
line.
all by itself right in the middle.
They got all their questions answered in the previous panel.
One brave soul comes up.
Thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask, you're speaking about soil carbon sequestration. I do a lot of work in regenerative agriculture and also work with many of the world's largest food and beverage companies kind of in a carbon accounting type of role. And I guess what I wanted to speak to was the role that you see accounting for soil carbon sequestration playing versus just simply kind of a feed additive that's going to reduce emissions. A lot of this is kind of predicated upon, emissions from cattle when they're out on grass at least, maybe not when they're standing on concrete, are a feedstock for soil microbiology. And so if we're trying to just reduce that emission, that, is that kind of missing the point versus, like I said, trying to find ways maybe through regenerative agriculture or otherwise to drive more sequestration of that carbon into the soil, and then how essentially at the end of the day do we account for that, and how do we allow those purchasers of the dairy products to account for that as well? Thanks.
Yeah, we could spend a long time on soil carbon sequestration for sure. In short, a couple different points maybe. One is that in the dairy industry, it's not commonly understood, or it's not commonly talked about, that in dairy one of the products you're producing besides milk is you're producing manure. Cows are eating and they're creating this nutrient-rich fertilizer on literally the back end of the cow that is then reapplied to the land that actually reduces a lot of the chemical or the manufactured nitrogen content that's needed for the crops to then produce the feed that then goes back to the cow. So you've got this whole nutrient cycling going on dairy operations. But more specifically to I think your point on how do we count soil carbon sequestration, everyone operates by the same rules today. So the greenhouse gas protocol, which creates the carbon accounting rules for emissions across all industries really, is later this year coming out with a slightly different version of that called the Land Sectors Removals Guidance, which is going to specifically inform how you count for carbon that's stored or locked within the soil through advanced root systems, et cetera. But we do, as a dairy industry, think there's a lot of space, still a lot of white space to further tap into the regenerative agriculture principles, which a lot of producers are already doing, like reducing soil tillage, so you're keeping that root structure intact. So when you plant a new crop, you're actually drilling your new crop directly into the soil instead of necessarily turning it with a plow every time. or planting a cover crop to protect your soil during the down season, for example, which some dairies will actually use that cover crop then to then feed their herd in the spring. So definitely agree, regenerative agriculture principles are important, and how you account for them are using these agreed upon standards, which generally goes back to the greenhouse gas protocol rules and what the industry expects for them to come out later this year with the land sector removals guidance. So hopefully that's helpful and answered your question.
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, hi. What do you think are the biggest barriers to scaling up in terms of sustainable practices? Do you think it's more tech related or policy, or is it just time, or like a mix of everything?
So the barriers to scaling up, meaning like as an industry or on an individual dairy?
Just to scaling up as to get, for example, more farmers to adopt certain practices.
Yeah. Yep. So I think it's the economics of this are really important, and so I don't really want to speak for other dairymen. I'll just assume what I think might be the case, but I really can't speak for everybody else. But I think most dairy producers, if there was an economic incentive, would be very much on board and very interested. I think if there's not an economic incentive, very few are going to be interested. I think it's just that simple. And so that's why the market part of this to me is so critical, that if there's an economic incentive, I think you're going to get a lot of people interested in jumping on board because it's so easy to do. And the example we're talking about here primarily is feeding something to our cows to reduce enteric methane emissions. It is easy as pie. You put it in the ration the next day, your cows eat it, effect happens immediately, and I don't have to invest any capital. I don't have to go build buildings or buy equipment or anything like that. It's just right in our ration. So it's really easy to get going. If there's a financial incentive, I would think most dairies would be very interested.
So the barrier is there's no incentives?
Say that.
Barriers, there's no incentives.
Yeah, the barriers, incentives, right. Without incentives, I just don't see people doing it. I really don't. There'll be maybe a small percentage that really wants to do what they think is the right thing. But again, like I said earlier, we're in a commodity industry, and you just can't afford to add cost to your product without some sort of return. You'll never survive if you do that.
Yeah, and the other part that I would add on the barriers, or maybe not a barrier, but maybe a limitation today, is the number of tools in the toolbox, right? So there are a few things that are available today that are easily scalable. So a digester is not, right? Costs millions of dollars, a big capital investment. Feed additives are much easier to put in. You're feeding the cow anyways every day. Is how do we get more tools into the toolbox so that producers have more options? They need the proper incentives, though, to actually implement those options. But I would say that is one of the, maybe not a barrier, but a limiter is how do we get more products more readily available to our producers here in the US. I think on the previous panel they mentioned like some of these products are approved in 40 other countries. They're still not approved here in the US today. Now, they absolutely need to be regulated. We want them to be safe. We want to be able to ensure that they're safe in food, they're safe for the animals. But how do we look at bringing those innovations more quickly to our producers so that they have more tools and we can implement faster versus, if we don't get these products till 2028, 2029, our window is closing on our ability to actually make an impact.
It's been said many times that, the answer to all your questions are money. Somebody was talking about different things. And not to say everybody's greedy, but if there's a financial incentive and I as a dairyman say, hey, I can use these products, guess what? 10 companies are going to be busting their gut trying to develop a product that they can sell to me that I can generate a credit for. So that just opens up the whole Pandora's box of, man, we got companies competing to produce products to capture more enteric methane, and that's how things go. So that the barrier to me really is the financial incentive. Once that happens, the whole thing can really take off from new products to adoption by dairy farmers. That'll make the whole thing work.
Really good question.
Hello, my name's Mike. I do marketing at a agritourism business in North Carolina. And I have this debate with our team. We're a small farm. We've got about 3,000 animals, polyculture type stuff. But like many other small farms, we're dubious about food label certifications and how they're really engineered for big kind of industrial conventional farms. And yet, being a marketer, I realize the potential for communication with the customer. This thing is certified. You don't have to just trust us. I wonder if you guys have had those debates with yourselves, with others in the industry. How do we get to these better practices, bringing the customer along and maybe managing or mitigating some of those barriers to using food labels like the new one, regenerative organic certified, as an example?
So, I mentioned the word commodity earlier, being like I consider our dairy a commodity dairy, that we're producing milk, so I'm not selling anything to consumers. All my milk goes to DFA, and they sell it to others who process it and eventually goes to consumers. So that's not something that I'm involved with. In your case, I would call a dairy that is able to sell directly to consumers more of a niche, right? And a niche market, meaning you can potentially and hopefully demand a better price because you're going right to consumers. In that situation, I would think there'd be an advantage to your customers to say, hey, I'm producing a product here, this cheese or this milk or this yogurt has a lower carbon footprint, and your customers would hopefully find value and say, yeah, I'll pay a little bit more for that because I like those practices. I don't have the option of doing that because my milk goes so many different places and there's so many different products and I don't even know where it all goes. So I just don't have that option at all in my dairy. And that's, I think most milk marketed in the U.S. kind of fits into that. So you have to go back as a whole industry, the DFAs of the world, to say, okay, we market this mammoth amount of milk. If we could get 30% of it or 50% of it or 20% of it that has a lower carbon footprint, the whole system has a lower carbon footprint, and that's more kind of a holistic view of the whole system. But in your case, I would think a verifiable credit that has integrity, that you could claim in your marketing that yes, we lowered our carbon footprint by these many credits. I think that's a win.
Yeah, this is likely probably a conversation we can continue on in talking about labels and what our view on labels are. We are up on time, so I don't want to cut it short, but we are going to go over to the Carbon Credit Cafe, the 3 C's. I had to remember exactly what those were. And Mike would love to have further conversation with you on exactly what some of the risk and opportunities are around labels. But thank you everyone for your participation today. We really appreciate you guys attending the event. Hopefully you saw some of the excitement and the tools and opportunity that is in this livestock space, particularly on the dairy farms, and our producers' willingness and really excitement around implementing this and really partnering not just with our food companies, but as we think about our overall mission on reducing our climate impact on the world. We believe there's lots of opportunity here. We're excited to get those opportunities. It's just aligning that and creating the right incentives and putting those in place. So thank you everyone for your time. Happy to chat more. Feel free to stop by and grab a bite to eat. I believe it's out the door and to the right. So thank you.